the GMing advice for the game is fascinating. The early part of the game is all about how we get to play our protagonists and do whatever we want. Because role playing is
Okay.
not like a board game. You can do whatever you want. And then the end in the GMing section has the most gorgeous, there's even a section called something like, preserve the illusion of choice. Yeah, I know
What?
it's super, super explicit. Super explicit, about the GM that's delivering this grand story and the players get to jump up and down in the middle of it. But
It's totally explicit on it.
totally, yeah.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah.
Wow.
But putting that aside,
Hmm.
putting that aside, if I were to play the game, I would just read the first part literally and forget the second part. And
Right. Right.
so the thing that I'm talking about in a game like this, though, is that if you take the setting reasonably seriously as characters moving in space and making decisions, and not only being desperate to survive, but also trying to be about something, because each of these different groups in the game, they are about things. And so, and they're not just trivial things, they're actually pretty interesting. So or compelling, as in my opinion.
Right.
So therefore, even though there's no numerical thing, we don't like roll to see whether her status goes up in the apocalyptics, or we don't, have some sort of mechanic by which we see how all the factions' relative positions, shift between
Right.
scenes or something. We don't have anything like that. But that's not to say that nothing of the sort can't happen. And I would maintain that in at least as potentially played in a game like this, if the game master treats what happened as a constraint upon what
Okay.
can happen. Right. So in other words, it's not
Okay.
like, well, what do I feel like having happen next? What will be the most fun to happen next? It's more like, no, what just happened?
Yeah.
And then if they're working from that. So with all that stated, I think what I'm trying to demonstrate is that there are hard and soft ways, and sometimes perhaps non immediate. It's not immediately obvious how the larger situation is affected by what just happened.
Sure.
Right. What I'm trying to get across is that either way, again, look at all the differences in the games, right? One of them has rolls to hit and duck and cover, and whether I pour this resource into what I do next. And the other one is very much, okay, here's this one roll setting things up. Here's this other roll, for how it resolves, and a whole lot of kind of narration of before and after the roll, with no constraint on does you know no constraint on whether the conversation between Dax um, and Banks got physical or something, right? There's there's no constraint on that. Whereas in the other game, those things are constrained by reaction, initiative, distance, and
Sure.
stuff like that. Um, but I maintain that what we don't want is a game where you don't have such a connection, where whatever happens in the scene just flattens.
Okay.
And then what happens next, or any change on the larger picture, is unconstrained, just unconstrained, just basically following the advice in the back of DeGenesis, which says no matter what happens, make it go the way you want, right?
Right.
And
Sure.
it's for their own good, it's for
Of
their own
course.
good. I mean,
Yeah.
making sure it's fun for them, after all. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty much what it says. I really ought to scan those pages, right? Um, the the thing with my argument here is that
Hmm.
over-purposing it has a way of killing the fun inside the scene. So that if you, for example, if you have no reason inside the situation because you see in the hour between dog and wolf, the only real thing you have going for you is the plot points. Whether you're really
Okay.
going to like hammer plot points into the resolution roll or not,
Okay.
and the way you get them is extremely. You might end up sucking wind on plot points or be flushing them at another time. You get them on the first roll or fail to get them on the first roll.
Mhm.
And you keep the ones that you haven't spent, but then, do you really want to spend them on that second roll is the important point. So you are kind of like riding the waves of the plot points. And that's where you're kind of throwing yourself into, that's why the game doesn't play itself, basically. Um, but for example, you can't use plot points to overturn someone else's success or anything like that. Um, so you can't really massage things with the plot points. It's just a matter of throwing things in. What I'm saying though is that people tend to do that in the hour between dog and wolf due to the fiction of the moment and also their recognition of whether they're losing the advantage in a particular direction, so that certain
Gotcha.
types of scenes are going to be disastrous for them, most likely. So they're throwing plot points in due to their commitment, not to the ultimate outcome. They're throwing it in for the commitment of the moment.
Gotcha.
And that's what I'm talking about. If you care about what's happening in the moment and you throw your commitment into it, then if the results have something to do with the larger picture, it's very satisfying.
Gotcha.
But if it doesn't matter what you do, so that basically it doesn't matter if you punch the guy or kiss the guy, you're still going to get like an intensity point, right? And then the intensity points like have to reach a certain level for something to happen. You see what I mean? And it doesn't matter
Yeah.
what they are or how it relates to the
Gotcha.
fiction of the moment. And in a lot of ways, I think that a lot of the games that we're seeing have a tendency for the fiction of the moment to be sort of full of sound and fury, but really not unique in terms of what decisions you're going to make. Especially ones that
Okay.
might put you at risk for later, like burning the vitality or spending those plot points, which are more alike than they seem.
Well, it's a resource.
Mm-hmm.
They're both resources.
And they're very
Yeah.
expendable resources. Very, very. They have a big impact on what's going on, but they're also not guaranteed. Neither one of you buys you a success. Neither one of them buys a
Sure.
success, right? So
Right.
you're risking the resource,
Yeah.
and it's the worst kind of risk. You have to spend it. You're going to lose it, or you're going to get a benefit from it. Period.
Right.
And so, you're going to lose it either way. So
Yeah.
and under these circumstances, the sense of immediacy, even when you have like an hour between dog and wolf, you've got a pretty big block of time and the possibility to jump all around the location and the possibility of shifting to different people and stuff like that, all within one turn. Even in a situation like that, there's a sense of immediacy to the use of the mechanic.
Okay.
Right?
Gotcha.
So without that, there's a tendency for these kind of gaseous attempts to make the fiction more exciting just by kind of pumping it up without, but it doesn't really matter what it looks like because you're going to roll this die to see if you get like a realm point or not anyway.
Oh, gotcha. You mean it?
Right.
It almost has the wushu problem of
Right.
what you say doesn't really matter because you're going to get this number of dice. So,
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So the content of what you say is irrelevant.
Right. And I'm speaking specifically, instead of wushu, which is about in the moment anyway, you're right about the analogy, but extend it further so that we're talking about larger situation impacts.
Right. Okay.
Even if they're indirect. I mean, even if they're super indirect, like in DeGenesis.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
mean, I think that they exist in DeGenesis, but they are very indirect. You have to start thinking about, well, if that guy knows this or if she has this resource, then what would they do? Right? That kind of thing. But the connections are there to be used if you will use them.
Right. If
Um,
someone wants to. No.
yeah. And so, as if
Okay.
I were game mastering DeGenesis, I would say to myself, my job is to do exactly that.
Gotcha.
Right? Just take it on myself to care about the first instruction and not the second. So with that stated, we're looking at your game because you have quite a task. If you overpurpose the in scene mechanics to affect the larger world,
Right.
if you underpurpose them, for lack of a better word, so that they don't, I mean, if it's just arbitrary how it affects the larger world,
Sure.
um, then there's, I'm not saying there's like a knife edge of perfection point you have to find.
Sure.
I just think there's two very negative edge cases.
Yes.
Fortunately, the range in between is pretty broad, but
Right.
but that's, as we just see, right? These two games superficially could not be less alike. Or sorry,
Correct.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So, whereas I actually think that there's a lot more alike about them than one might think. So with that broad range of design and how the dice work to play with, you don't have to feel like you're forced into a corner of design. But
I understand.
yeah, but it's an important principle, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's kind of where I wanted to go for
Okay.
this evening. So I did get the document file, and therefore I was looking at it and saying, okay, I'm kind of getting the idea about like how to run around and fight and stuff, but I want to know this part. I want to think,
Yeah.
or I want my new thinking about this part.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. We didn't really get a chance to play much, but I don't think it's really playable at this point, right? Or maybe only a little.
Only a little.
Yeah.
I mean, a little bit. Yeah.
Maybe it's best for you to poke at it with some, supportive people first.
Okay.
Because for consulting purposes, I think it needs to be a little more
filled out.
A few more pieces of the parts that you're interested in.
Yeah.
To
okay. So what would you recommend I do next? So I should try to fill in more, and then
well,
would you recommend doing another series of 3?
There's a couple of,
how would you?
Okay. My suggestion is that filling in more is probably best managed through play. So get a couple people together and have them roll some dice around. Tell them that you're not trying to impress them with anything, and that you hope they love you anyway. And so it's not really about like play testing. It's just to get characters running around in motion in your head.
Okay.
And then I suspect that once you get a look at that, then you'll say, oh, and then that means these things become, the role to affect the situation. Or maybe there's an indirect factor, or maybe there's something that you say, it's going to be really easy to see how this affects the larger situation, and you'll know whether you want it to have a number or not, or have a role or not, or have or what it's based on. You'll have I think a stronger idea of what you think is the right direct/indirect way for that to happen.
Okay.
And whether you really need it to be about the larger world. The way you were describing is like ripple effects way out there.
Yeah.
That's why I'm talking about it this way. So it's my understanding, like in the scenario you were talking about, we're not really specifically talking about a roll to see what happens with the space yacht. That is accounted for in play.
Right.
So what we're interested in is like how the word gets around or doesn't.
Yeah.
So yeah, with that in mind, therefore, how do we take what happened? Because they're, by definition, it can't be something like, well, if they capture it, then the word will get out. No, we want there to be a contingent and very indirect effects of some kind, regardless of what happens, or almost regardless of what happens.
Hmm.
So that's kind of what you have to think about. But it's
Okay.
better if you're putting that to names and faces of characters whom you've seen played by people in desperate circumstances.
Okay.
And in that, so if you get like just a little bit of that under your belt and
Hmm.
scribble something down, and maybe even in
Hmm.
the heat of the moment, you're like, oh, well, okay, everybody, like make this roll, roll this, and then we'll see how this bounces out to the larger world, as some
Okay.
final step in play. But exactly what that is may be better left to your intuition once you've seen characters like take a plasma bolt to the chest.
Okay. All right.
Right. So at
Hmm.
that point, the question is whether we would move to another set of 3 sessions.
Right.
And at that point, playing is very much called for, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
All
Cool.
right. Well, I've got 15 minutes before Gamma World, so
Okay. Better let you go then.
yeah. Wish me luck.
Best luck. Best luck with all those mutants. Yeah.
Exactly. Take care, man.
Bye bye. Thank you, Ron.